All right, let's do MANOVA from week 2. So what makes bad test takers bad test takers? Is it that they are anxious in general, or is it that they are anxious specifically about taking tests? So we got some good and bad test takers, so generalized anxiety and their test taking specific anxiety. And the first thing you got to do is run a bunch of correlations. So we'll get a bivariate and correlate. And short answer is just throw everything in the box on the right and click OK. Yeah, we got a bunch of correlations. So test taker type, so two-tailed alpha, 0.05, test taker type and generalized anxiety. Test taker type and generalized anxiety is right here, and it's negative. So generalized anxiety goes up, test taker type goes down. Okay, well, what's test taker type going down mean? Well, for test taker type over here, you've got good test takers and bad test takers. A low value on test taker type is bad test takers. A higher value is 2, which is good test takers. So anxiety tends to be higher among those who are lower on test taker type. That is bad test takers, right? Higher anxiety, lower test taker is 1. That is bad test takers. So what we want to write here is something along the lines of bad test takers have higher generalized anxiety. All right, so that's one finding. I guess we could go tend to just be all like even more correct. Fine. All right, bad test takers tend to have higher generalized anxiety, and I don't know why I capitalized this. All right, so next one is test taker type and test anxiety. So here's test anxiety and test taker type, also significant, also negative. So as test taking anxiety goes up, test taker type tends to go down. What is lower on test taker type? That's a 1, that's your bad test taker. So you can almost copy this exact sentence on over here, which I'm going to, and modify. Bad test takers tend to have higher test specific anxiety. That is also true. So if you got to summarize it, you'd say, bad test takers tend to be higher on generalized anxiety and test taking anxiety. Finally, the two anxieties together, what's their correlation? Where do we find that? Looks like it's here. Generalized with test taking, positive. Those who tend to have higher test taking or generalized anxiety tend to have higher test taking anxiety. So regardless of test taker type, we're just saying higher test specific test taking, taking anxiety tends to be associated with higher generalized anxiety. Something like that is correct. So those who are more anxious tend to be more anxious about test taking, something like that. Tends to be associated with higher generalized. Yep, that's correct. So I should file and save as. Oops, no, don't need to change that. All right. So we're going to run our actual MANOVA now. I'm going to go to Analyze, General Linear Model, and Multivariate. In this box, we take both of our DVs, which are generalized anxiety and test taking anxiety, and we put them in the DVs box. And we have to also, hopefully I say, there we go, test takers to the factors box. Under options, we click it and get descriptives. Cool. One of the rare times they don't ask you to get homogeneity tests. It's just a little bit too much at this point. Click continue and click OK. All right, so here is our output, and let's interpret it. So based on the typical multivariate tests, right here, and looking at Hotelling's trace, not for intercept, we need it for test taker type, Hotelling's trace, there we go. Do the multivariate vectors of combined generalized and test taking anxiety differ between those who are good and bad test takers? Well, what the hell does that mean? Let's break it down. So here's Hotelling's trace for test taker type. 0.001 or 0.011, that's less than 0.05. So whatever's being compared here differs, right? Well, what's being compared? Well, it's comparing good and bad test takers on what? Well, combined generalized anxiety and test taking specific anxiety. It's like a three-dimensional sort of thing. So the short story is you can conclude that good and bad test takers differ on combined generalized and test taking anxiety together. So that's what the multivariate test tells you. So do the multivariate differ? I guess all I asked for was yes. So yes, they differ significantly. Good and bad test takers differ on combined generalized and test taking anxiety. So there are no means that you can look at to say how, by the way. There is no like 3D mean or combined mean it shows you. That's why you have to keep going and do the follow-up step down tests. So write the results of Hotelling's trace, use this format. I'm going to cheat and copy it right here because why not, right? Boom, paste it in there. I'm gonna bold it and let's fill it in. Hotelling's trace is equal to some number to 2 decimals. Where the heck's that? Test taker type, Hotelling's trace is right here, 0.173, so 0.17. Our degrees of freedom, so it's the F equivalent of our degrees of freedom of 2 and what error next to it? Oh, there we go, 2 and 57. Cool. I was like, what have I asked them to do? But it is there. So 2 degrees of freedom between and 57 degrees of freedom error. And that F that is equivalent to is right here, 4.93. And is P less than or greater than? It's less than 0.05. All right, that's our Hotelling's trace written up in fancy APA format. And for whatever reason, it's decided to bold this entire thing, and I kind of don't care. Oh, maybe I do care. No color. All right. No, stop. Stupid thing. What have I done? No. And now it wants me to mark it. Anyway, I'm just going to make things worse. So, step down, part 1, the primary DV of interest. So based on this table that's OD in here called test between subjects effects, under test taker type, there's 2 lines, generalized and test taking anxiety. So remember, the hypothesis here is that the reason that they're bad test takers, but if you remove variability due to generalized anxiety, do bad test takers still differ from good test takers on test specific anxiety? So the thought is really that it's general anxiety that causes them to be bad test takers, not test specific anxiety. And so our primary DV of interest here, under test taker types, there's both tests here. It's generalized anxiety is the one we want. So this is that univariate ANOVA comparing them on generalized anxiety. It's going to be statistically significant. So based on the test, we got to use our Bonferroni of 0.025. Don't forget to do that. In fact, I'll just highlight that so we don't forget. Do the good and bad test takers differ on generalized anxiety? If so, how? Short answer is yes, that's less than 0.025. And so how do they differ? Well, we got to look at the means. So we've got right here, generalized anxiety, bad test takers are 11, good were 10. So bad test takers are higher on generalized anxiety. So that's what we got to write. Bad test takers are higher on generalized anxiety. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Moving on, write the results of the step down ANOVA in fancy SPSS format. And I give you the formula for doing the eta squared. So let's do that here. Cheat a little, call it a day, and you can try doing that. So we have an F with 1 and 58 degrees of freedom. So F of 1 and 58 degrees of freedom is equal to 58 was error. 7.91, we round that. P was less than 0.025. And where's the eta squared? Oh, eta squared. Okay, I kind of lost the eta squared. Good going. Let's try that again. Eta squared equals something to 2 decimals. Let's figure it out together. So I give you the formula here because, you know, I don't have these things memorized for everything either. So just to let you know, it's the sum of squares for the effect divided by the sum of squares of the effect plus the sum of squares of error. So the first thing we got to get is that sum of squares of effect plus sum of squares of error. So sum of squares for our effect was 14.017. So let's get that. 14.017 right there. Error is 102.833. So plus 102.833. I get 116.85. 116.85. And what is that? That is the sum of that sum of squares and error sum of squares, because that's what we need here. Sum of squares of effect plus sum of squares of error. So we're going to divide our 114.00147 by that total we just got. So 14.017 divided by, I wrote it down this time, 116.85. We get 0.1199, so 0.12 is what we would round that to. That's our eta squared. So now we're going to go ahead and do our second part of our step down analysis, which is a ANCOVA comparing good and bad test takers on test specific anxiety after we remove differences between those groups on generalized anxiety. So it is an ANCOVA. So here we go to general linear model, and we go to univariate, and we're going to put test specific or test taken anxiety in the dependent. Test taker type is our fixed factor. Generalized anxiety is our covariate. And what else? EM means. Got to get our EM means, so we get our adjusted means. And under options, make sure to get descriptives. And that's it, because that'll give us our unadjusted means. All right, click OK. We run it. We've done an ANCOVA now. So we got to fill in all the stuff in this table and finish the sucker up. So again, this is an analysis of covariance. These are the raw means for test taking anxiety. These are the adjusted means for test taking anxiety. All right, so this one went up a little, this one went down a little, they moved a little bit closer compared to here. So let's fill in our table. Our sum of squares for generalized anxiety, that is our covariate, is 45.497, so 0.50. Degrees of freedom for that are 1. Mean square is also 45.50. Our F value is 30.44. 30.44. Is that less than 0.05? You bet it is. It gets a star. No eta squared for that. 30.44. For test taker type, it's 2.757, so 2.76 maybe. Our degrees of freedom for that is also 1. Our mean square is also 2.76. Our F value is a tiny little 1.845, so 1.85. No double star for you, but we do have to figure out eta squared in a sec. So our error is 85.20. Degrees of freedom for errors, 57. Mean square is 1.495, so 1.50. And totals, again, just add this stuff, folks. You never know if one of these total or corrected total are going to be right. So I say just add it. 45.50 plus 2.76 plus 85.20 is 133.46. So let me double check that. That's what it looks like anyway. Is 45. I'll do the long version. 45.497 plus 2.757 plus 85.203. I get 133.457, so 0.46. And degrees of freedom, I can do that one in my head. 57 plus 1 is 59. So to get this eta squared, we don't use the total because it's ANCOVA. We don't want to count variability accounted for by the covariate. We want to count for leftovers. So again, we got to get sum of squares for effect and sum of squares error. What is that total? So let's do that. So sum of squares effect is 45.50. Oh, I take that back, 2.76. Lord, that was bad. Plus the error is 85.20. Is 87.96. And that is the sum of this and the sum of that. And then we divide 2.76 by that. So 2.76 divided by 87.96 is 0.03 is what I get for here. 0.03. So something very small and consistent with being not significant. All right. So does the covariate appear to account for a significant amount of variability and test anxiety? It sure does. Sig was less than 0.05. So yes. And I'll even add that sig was less than 0.05, just to make it clear how I got there. Add that in here. Using the Bonferroni corrected alpha level, do the groups differ on test anxiety after removing differences and generalized anxiety? Negatory. So no, sig was greater than 0.025. So what does this mean? So we know that good and bad test takers differ on generalized anxiety. Those who are bad test takers had higher generalized anxiety. We showed that earlier, right? However, if you account for differences between good and bad test takers and the generalized anxiety, that is, use it as a covariate, they no longer differ on test-specific anxiety. And so interestingly, you might have seen earlier, there was a univariate test comparing test taker types. We used this one for generalized anxiety. We didn't use the one for test taking anxiety, but should you have been cheating, you would have noticed, hey, they do differ on test taking anxiety initially. But after we adjust for generalized anxiety, we go from an F value of 8 to an F value of 1.85, so no longer significant. So hopefully that made sense. Go ahead and write it up. And if you have questions, go ahead and post them in discussion.